Marian Harper, a 74-year-old woman with sharp eyes and gray curls, lay in her hospital room. The walls were sterile white, devoid of decoration, and the air was thick with the heavy scent of antiseptic. Outside the window, the scene was gray. Rain lazily trickled down the glass, blending with the distant murmurs from the hallway. In the silence, time seemed to slow down, leaving Marian alone with her restless thoughts. She wasn't the type to panic. Over the years, Marian had learned to maintain her composure, no matter the circumstances. But right now, there was one thing that troubled her. Her three beloved cats, Minerva, Simon, and Bella, were alone at home. The memory of Minerva curiously watching every cup of tea she made, of Simon settling comfortably on the couch, and Bella always getting underfoot, warmed her heart. These little creatures were her family, her quiet companions. Her neighbor, who had promised to look after the cats, had suddenly moved to another state, and despite all her efforts, Marian hadn't been able to find anyone else to help. She tried to explain this to the hospital staff, but the nurses only nodded sympathetically without taking any real action. To them, she was just another elderly patient with her small problems. "Miss Harper, everything will be fine," one of the nurses said, adjusting her pillow. "We know you're worried, but right now, your health is the most important thing." The comforting words only made her worry more. No one was really listening to her. Marian felt the invisible walls of loneliness closing in, as though the room was getting smaller by the minute. The only person who truly heard her was a young nurse named Sarah Brooks. At 28, with a warm smile and expressive brown eyes, Sarah had accidentally overheard Marian's conversation with the duty nurse. Sarah looked like an ordinary young woman, wearing a white coat with her dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, but there was something special about her gaze, a combination of genuine kindness and confidence. "Excuse me, I didn't mean to overhear," she began, a little embarrassed. "But you mentioned you have cats at home?" "Yes, 3 of them," Marian replied, lifting her head. "I just don't know what's going to happen to them. They're used to me being around, especially Minerva. She gets anxious if I'm gone too long." "I'll help you, Mrs. Harper. Tell me what needs to be done." Those words felt like a ray of light in a dark tunnel. Marian sat up in bed, looking at the young nurse with gratitude and faint hope. "Are you serious? It won't take long, but I can't leave them alone." Marian's voice wavered as she tried to explain the importance of the situation. "I have everything ready at home, food, water, just check on them, make sure they're okay." Sarah listened carefully to the elderly woman, then nodded confidently. "Of course. Write down your address, give me the key, and I'll take care of it. Don't worry." Marian felt a warm sense of relief spread through her chest. For the first time in days, her anxiety started to ease. Slowly, she reached for her purse at the head of the bed and pulled out a small keychain with the house keys. Her fingers trembled as she handed them to Sarah. "Thank you, dear. You have no idea how much this means to me." "I understand," Sarah replied softly. "Animals are family. You can count on me." The next day, after finishing her shift, Sarah headed to the address Marian had given her. Marian's house stood in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by old maples and well-kept flower beds. Sarah immediately noticed how well the owner took care of her home. Potted flowers on the porch, sparkling clean windows, and curtains with a soft floral pattern. Sarah inserted the key into the lock and the door opened smoothly. She was greeted by the scent of fresh flowers and something cozy, homey. At the threshold, a large black cat appeared, likely Minerva. Her golden eyes studied the visitor with clear suspicion. "Hi there, beautiful," Sarah whispered, kneeling down. "I'm from your mom." Minerva slowly approached, sniffing Sarah's hand, and seemed to approve of her presence. Soon, Simon, a fluffy orange cat, and Bella, a white cat with a black spot on her nose, appeared from deeper in the house. They sniffed Sarah, rubbed against her legs, as if they sensed she was there with good intentions. Sarah made sure the water and food bowls were full, and that everything was in order. Spending some time with the cats, she noticed how the tension from her long workday began to melt away. These sweet creatures seemed to offer her a sense of peace, as though they were thanking her for her care. When Sarah returned to the hospital, she stopped by Marian's room. "Everything's fine," she said with a smile. "Your fur babies are happy and healthy." Tears welled up in Marian's eyes. She took Sarah's hand and quietly said, "You're a kind person, dear. Thank you." Those words touched Sarah's heart. She didn't know just how much this simple, sincere act of help would change her life. Sarah received the keys to Mrs. Harper's apartment and headed to her home. After taking the elevator to the top floor, she stopped in front of a massive door with a brass nameplate bearing the owner's last name. The sense of occasion grew as she turned the key in the lock and stepped inside. She was greeted by an entirely different world, calm, majestic, filled with the scent of old books and wood. Mrs. Harper's apartment was stunning in its decor. Every detail seemed to breathe history. Antique furniture, heavy curtains with tassels, paintings in ornate frames, and display cabinets showcasing delicate porcelain. Sarah couldn't help but hold her breath as she looked at the bookshelves, lined with editions whose bindings seemed like artifacts. The house seemed to tell its own story, and Sarah felt a thrill at being part of this mystery. Her thoughts were interrupted by a barely audible rustling. 3 pairs of eyes watched her carefully from different corners of the room. The first to appear was Minerva, a large black cat with golden eyes that gleamed like polished gold. She walked proudly, tail high, as if inspecting the uninvited guest. Following her cautiously was the orange tabby, Simon. Last to show up was Bella, the elegant white cat with a black spot on her nose. Sarah smiled. "Well, hello there, you fluffy guardians. I hope we'll become friends." Minerva, deciding that the human posed no threat, slowly approached. She sniffed Sarah's hand and then, to Sarah's surprise, rubbed her face against her palm. Simon, twitching his fluffy whiskers, headed toward the owner's display cabinet where his favorite toy, a mouse on a string, usually sat. Bella circled around and settled at Sarah's feet, looking up at her expectantly. Sarah understood that looking after the cats was more than just a task. It was a responsibility, a duty to care for beloved creatures. She found the bowls of food and water in the kitchen, perfectly placed on the immaculately clean tiles. The food was high quality, and the placemats under the bowls were spotless. Mrs. Harper cares for her pets with love, Sarah thought as she filled the bowls. She couldn't shake the feeling that these animals held a special place in their owner's life. Once the feeding was done, Sarah decided to explore the apartment. Beyond the elegant furniture, her attention was drawn to the photographs on the walls. Most of them were black and white, capturing family moments, smiles, and glimpses of happiness. In one photo, Marian was young, with a short haircut, surrounded by friends. In another, she was older, sitting in a chair with Minerva on her lap. The photos told the story of her life, a life filled with events but also surrounded by solitude. On the writing desk, there was an intricately carved jewelry box. Sarah didn't want to be too nosy, but her gaze lingered on it. The surface of the box was adorned with detailed patterns, and it seemed to be handmade. Nearby were a pair of glasses in a thin frame and a pen, as though Marian had just been writing something. Sarah felt a slight thrill, as if she had been allowed a brief glimpse into the private corner of someone's soul. As Sarah admired the interior, the cat seemed to sense her calm. Minerva cozied up on the windowsill, Simon stretched and curled up on a chair, and Bella, squinting slightly, fell asleep right on the rug. Sarah quietly sat beside her, running her fingers through Bella's soft fur. It was so peaceful that, for a moment, it seemed like the whole world around her had stopped. Time passed, and Sarah decided to return to the hospital, but she couldn't leave without leaving a short note for Mrs. Harper. Finding a notebook and a pen, she wrote, "Your furry friends are fine. Food and water, everything's in place. They seem happy. Don't worry, I'll be back again." She left the note on the desk, took one last look at the cozy home, and closed the door behind her. When Sarah returned to Marian, she was lying in bed, staring out the window. The young nurse approached, and the elderly woman turned her head, eager for news. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Harper," Sarah said with a smile. "Your fur babies are happy and healthy. Minerva tried to show who's boss, but we got along in the end. Simon's in his usual mood, and Bella's sleeping right on the rug." Marian smiled, though her eyes glistened with tears. "Thank you, dear. You've done more for me than you can imagine. These cats are all I have." Sarah gently took her hand. "Don't worry, they're in good hands. I'll check on them again if you need me." Marian nodded then, gathering her thoughts, added, "You know, this house, it's been my sanctuary for so many years. It holds everything dear to me. Sometimes I think that if it weren't for these cats, I'd have given up a long time ago." Sarah began visiting Marian every day. There was a void in her life when it came to meaningful connection, and the hospital had become a place where she could find at least some kind of bond with the outside world. She would talk about her cats, their quirks, and how one of them, Luna, had once managed to hide in the closet for an entire day, leaving her in a desperate search. Sarah spoke with such sincerity that Marian couldn't help but smile, forgetting, even if only for a moment, about her illnesses and the exhausting routine of hospital life. Marian listened intently, as if she, too, was hungry for these simple yet heartwarming stories. In return, she began sharing her own. Since arriving at the hospital, Marian had opened up to Sarah in unexpected ways. Beneath her strict, almost aristocratic demeanor, there was a woman with an astonishingly rich life experience. In her youth, Marian had been a successful antiques dealer. Someone who traveled the world for years in search of rare items and collectibles. She had toured much of the globe, met collectors, historians, and artists, and purchased priceless works of art at auctions. Her stories were tinged with nostalgia, pride for the path she had taken. Marian often repeated how important it was to see beauty in the simple things and not to lose yourself in the chase for material wealth. With every word she spoke, Sarah felt her own life fill with new colors, as if it became easier to breathe despite all her own worries and anxieties. Sarah had recently moved to the city, and while she had tried to settle in, loneliness remained her constant companion. She had barely managed to make any friends, and her habits and desires went unnoticed by those around her. She couldn't help but notice how her relationship with Marian deepened and gained meaning with every visit. It wasn't just friendly conversation anymore, it had become a true source of warmth for her, something more important with each passing day. Despite her outward strength, Sarah was fragile inside, and her need for support had never been greater. Marian also felt the relief these visits brought her. The hospital room, which she had grown accustomed to, no longer felt as threatening. Sarah's stories about her cats, about how she learned to care for them, made Marian think of her own past, of pets she once had, of friends she met at exhibitions and auctions. It felt as though those were different days, full of energy and life, but now the hospital and loneliness were constant reminders of how much time had passed. With each story, Marian opened up more. She spoke not just about her professional life, but also about her personal life, lost opportunities, people she had loved and who were now gone. One day she confessed that, despite all her wealth, her life had not been perfect. Many years ago, she had been married, but their relationship fell apart when her husband became consumed with his career, and she, in turn, became consumed with her collections. They began living parallel lives, and one day when Marian returned from another trip, he was no longer at home. She didn't blame him, but realized too late that she had also become distant from him. "And I didn't know how to ask for love," Marian said softly, staring out the window. "Maybe that was my mistake." Sarah didn't know how to respond, but she understood. Despite all the wealth, despite the collections and her successes in her profession, Marian was just as lonely as she was. Only Marian had realized it too late. A strong friendship truly blossomed between them. Each meeting brought a new revelation, sometimes funny, sometimes sad, but always sincere. Both Sarah and Marian felt how important these conversations were for them both. One day, sitting beside Marian in her hospital room, Sarah noticed a small antique photo album on her nightstand. Marian, noticing Sarah's gaze, smiled gently. "This is for you," she said. "When you leave, I want you to take something as a memory. It's an old album. I haven't looked at these pictures in a long time, but I think you'll find them interesting. It's a part of my life that I've left behind." Sarah felt a light ache in her chest, but she knew there was no point in refusing. She carefully took the album in her hands and opened it. On the old, yellowed pages were photographs of various cities, people, animals, and priceless antiques. All of this belonged to a woman who seemed to have lived in another time and another world. "I can't just leave you here," Sarah said, a little flustered, but with resolve in her voice. Marian looked at her quietly and replied, "You won't leave. You'll remember. And that's enough." They sat in silence, unsure of what to say, but understanding that this friendship, though brief, would stay with them forever. Sarah hadn't really known what it meant to truly relax for a long time. Every day, from early morning until late at night, she was busy working at the hospital, saving lives and caring for the sick. Few people noticed how exhausting those hours were for her, how often she drained her energy and time she could have spent with friends or simply resting. So when she finally decided to take a day off, Sarah could hardly believe that she'd actually get to sleep in and enjoy the company of people she hadn't seen in so long. She'd arranged for another nurse to visit Marian while she was away. Sarah had grown close to the elderly woman, who had been alone since the death of her husband and children. Although Marian had never once complained, Sarah still felt that she needed the company. She was fragile, but had a huge heart, and her home always radiated a special sense of peace and comfort. Sarah loved spending time with her, listening to her stories about the past, about the era she had grown up in. But the next morning turned out to be full of terror. Sarah had just started waking up when her phone rang, shattering the morning silence. It was the nurse who was supposed to relieve her at Marian's house. Her voice on the other end was filled with anxiety. "Sarah, I'm so sorry, but Mrs. Harper passed away last night." Everything in Sarah's body seemed to freeze, and her heart stopped. She couldn't believe her ears. It was over. She had lost her friend, even though she'd been with her just yesterday. The funeral was quiet, as expected. The whole town came to say their goodbyes to a woman who, though quiet and a bit distant, had left an indelible mark on the hearts of those who knew her. Sarah took the loss hard. She couldn't understand how it had happened. Just yesterday, she had been holding her hand, sharing the latest worries, and now there was no one, no way to change anything. And while Sarah knew that life went on, the emptiness never left her. A few days later, when the grief had somewhat subsided, a man in a sharp suit showed up at her door. He was tall, with blue eyes and a gaze full of confidence. He introduced himself as Marian's lawyer and explained that there was an urgent matter he needed to discuss with Sarah. "Mrs. Harper left a will," he said, opening a file and pulling out several sheets of paper. "And you, Sarah, inherited everything she owned." Sarah couldn't believe it. She tried to process what she was hearing, but each word felt like a thunderclap. The lawyer continued, "The apartment, her collections, and a large sum of money have been transferred to your account. But there is one condition." Sarah sighed. It was hard to imagine that the elderly woman, who had been so private about her affairs, had left her something so valuable. In disbelief, she asked, "What's the condition?" Mrs. Harper asked that part of these funds go toward establishing a shelter for cats. She cared deeply for animals, especially the homeless ones, and it was her last wish that her legacy continue to care for those she loved. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Marian had always been a woman of strong character and a surprisingly kind heart, and if she wanted Sarah to continue her work, it was more than just financial help. It was a legacy of love and compassion that Sarah now had to bring to life. Marian's will opened a whole new world for Sarah. She realized that her life would never be the same. A sense of responsibility grew inside her. It wasn't just about money and possessions. This was a chance to change not only her life, but also the lives of others, including animals. Every day, she became more aware that this path she was on wasn't one she would have chosen herself. This twist of fate became the moment that made her see the world in a different light, where caring for others became the foundation of her existence. And so began a new chapter in Sarah's life, full of surprises and responsibility that she never could have dreamed of. Sarah accepted the inheritance with a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility. The realization that she was now responsible for continuing Marian's legacy took over her completely. Every step, every decision she made with the thought of doing things exactly as Marian would have wanted. Sarah didn't just take on managing the shelter. She felt that this was her mission now. It was more than just a job, it was her calling. The first few months were tough. Setting up the shelter took a lot of time and effort. Finding the right building, assembling a team, sorting out paperwork, meeting with architects and designers. But her belief in the importance of this mission gave her the strength to push forward. Sarah dreamed of a shelter that would truly be a home for the animals, not just a temporary place to stay. A home where every kitten, every adult pet would feel safe and loved. Soon, a modern shelter for cats opened in the heart of the city, cozy, with spacious playrooms and a green garden where the animals could enjoy sunny days. The space was thoughtfully designed down to the last detail: soft beds, cat houses, toys, and even a resting corner for visitors. The shelter was named Harper House, in honor of Marian, whose warmth and love for animals were now embodied in this place. As Sarah worked on the project, she felt a new sense of purpose entering her life. She truly grew to love her work and, more importantly, realized that she was helping not only the animals, but also the people. Every day brought new joys. She saw happy people adopting their new furry friends. Each cat finding its family was a little miracle, and Sarah joyfully became part of those stories. She was proud that she had created a place that had become a real home for so many. People who came to Harper House often thanked her for the opportunity. Sarah began to believe that animals really could understand people better than they understood themselves. Regardless of their age or appearance, they were all looking for the same thing as humans: love, care, and protection. And maybe that's where the magic lay. Every day Sarah remembered Marian's words: "Animals understand us better than we think." These words became her guiding star. She felt that the animals, who had been saved and were now finding homes, not only brought joy to people, but also helped them return to their better selves. Soon, Sarah realized that Harper House had become more than just a shelter. It had become a place where people genuinely began to care for one another, where true friendships were formed between people and animals, and sometimes even between people themselves. In her heart, she grew more and more confident that she was doing something truly important and necessary for the community. And this sense of purpose she found in her work became her anchor in the moments when she faced difficulties. Sarah knew she wasn't alone, and that her mission, this, was her happiness. One evening, as Sarah was getting ready to close the shelter, her gaze happened to linger on a corner where a small white kitten was hiding. Its deep blue eyes, like two lakes, reflected not only the light of the evening sun, but also a strange, indescribable feeling. Sarah didn't immediately understand what drew her to this tiny creature, but when her eyes met its, something in her heart stirred. It was alone, just like she once had been. In that moment, it seemed as though the kitten was looking at her with a silent challenge, as if it already knew what she needed more than she knew herself. And in those eyes, there was intelligence, tenderness, and a faint echo of what had once been part of Marian, her best friend, whom Sarah had admired so deeply. Marian, with her extraordinary charisma, her light and shadow, who had left a deep imprint on Sarah's life. "Mimi," Sarah whispered, lifting the kitten into her arms. And in that moment, everything connected to Marian seemed to return to her life, intertwining with the quiet and peace of this little white creature. She didn't know why she chose that name, but it came to her as a response to years of memories about a friend who had left behind an invisible yet strong connection to her soul. Mimi became her constant companion. Everything that had once been tied to loneliness suddenly filled with light. Day by day, Sarah became more convinced that this cat wasn't just a fluffy friend, it was something more. Sarah could feel that something of Marian lived in her. Perhaps it was her determination, her outlook on life, or her ability to find light even in the darkest corners of the world. Mimi reminded her of everything she had loved in Marian, that inner fire, which would ignite in the most unexpected situations, refusing to burn out even in the toughest of times. Sometimes, Sarah would sit in the armchair holding Mimi close and reflect on how much had changed over the years. Once her life had been full of chaos and unanswered questions. But now, in the shadow of the old armchair and cozy home, she began to understand that the most important things in life were love and care. It was what we gave to others without expecting anything in return. It was what stayed with us even when time and events took people away, leaving only memories. Sarah felt that her connection with Marian, though not obvious, still existed. It was like a warm thread stretching through space and time, linking their souls. And Mimi was part of that thread, bridging the past and the present, connecting two worlds, the one Marian had once been part of, and the one where Sarah continued to search for her path. Sometimes it seemed to her that everything that had happened in her life had been predestined, as if invisible forces were guiding her steps, leading her to once again feel a connection with those she had lost. The final moments of this story always led her back to Marian's room, once full of noise and life, now quiet and empty, yet still holding the spirit of her friend. Now, after many years, that room had transformed into a home for new stories, stories full of hope, warmth, and new encounters that were meant to come into her life. The room, where once they both laughed and talked until morning, now quietly held the memory of the moments they had shared together. Sarah closed her eyes, holding Mimi close, and realized that despite all the losses, her life was still going on. And in this continuation, despite the years and the distances, she still felt Marian's presence, felt her warmth and light. It wasn't an ending, but a new chapter, one where she had learned to let go, but not forget. Because love, like memory, doesn't disappear. It lives in us, filling each of our days, creating new moments and new connections. And this was her path, her connection with those she had loved, and with those who were yet to enter her life.